Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode. My name's Devan. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're new here, welcome. I'm glad that you're excited to go ahead and dive into something like The Will to Power. It was a very intimidating book for me in many ways, but I'm glad to have gotten through. I'm very excited that you're here and that you're willing to dive into these ideas and contribute to the conversation that I'm trying to develop here. And so also I do want to mention, I'm a little bit stuffy. I'm dealing with some allergies and haven't gotten hit by allergies this bad in a couple of years. We had an extra long winter, and so I'm sure that all contributes into it. And so I'm going to try to make it as brief. And this is also like my fourth time recording this. I don't know what's been going on. Either my audio cuts out or my camera dies. And yeah, it's been fun. But this is like my fourth time, so hopefully I've gotten rid of the excess by now and that we can go through it. But without further ado, this is an overview of The Will to Power. That's what I hope to provide for you today, and also my thoughts on The Will to Power. And I'm going to draw out some ideas that Nietzsche talked about. Not all of them, because there's a lot of them, but I'm going to try to draw out some, and hopefully you can follow along. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on The Will to Power, whether you've read it or whether you're hesitant to read it, and maybe if you need some encouragement, maybe this is some encouragement to read it. I'm not sure. Hopefully we can find that out together. To dive into it a little bit, I'd want to talk why I wanted to read this and a bit about what took me so long. So this book, and I haven't actually finished the book. And so the book I finished was book one of the book. And so there's 4 books. There's 4 different sections that are titled books. And so there's 4 different books. And the first one is European Nihilism. And it really provides a background and a framework for nihilism as you go forward. And so I thought it was important to kind of break it apart. I thought about doing the whole book all in one review, but that is not possible. Certainly not possible, especially because so many of these ideas are so pertinent to many of the contemporary issues that we're facing today. And so I'm going to break it down into 4 different parts, and I haven't gotten through the other 3 parts, and so that'll be some time down the road, but I will get there. Also, I'd love it if you'd let me know whether or not I should dive into some of the more concepts a bit deeper, and especially like the framework. I know that gets a little kind of crazy, and so it'd be something that'd be nice to know because I want to dive into it, but I'm just not sure if that's something that you all would be willing to watch and to dive in with me. So let me know down below whether or not I should dive into that or anything like that. But so what took me so long? And so it took me a year and a half to read through book 1. I took my time, that is safe to say, and so I wanted to make sure that I read the book and grasped the ideas as well as I could, because there is so many rich lessons in here that give way to what we are facing today. And why that's important to me, I guess, is that I just graduated with a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. And so I see individuals who encounter these ideas and are impacted by these, especially the younger generations, because we know that the young generation, that Generation Z and further on, is experiencing just a horrible mental health crisis. And so I think it's important that we understand the ideas that they're facing, and so I wanted to dive into it. And because we have depression, anxiety rates that are through the roof. I think 70% of Gen Z says that they have anxiety that significantly impacts them. I think that was the wording that was used. But we also have skyrocketing suicide rates. And I think that's really important that we discuss what might be underneath that. Why? Because never before have we encountered such a thing. And so I think it's important that we dive into these like foundational ideas that the individuals might be encountering, whether they know it or not, because we live in a world where we have unconscious thoughts. And so it's important to parse those out and understand a bit further on what's going on. And so that's a bit of my motivation as a therapist, I guess, to dive into these. Also, I love ideas. And so I want to give as many ideas, as much thought as I can. I enjoy them. Now, I'm not trained as a philosopher. I got a minor in it in my undergrad, and so nothing significant. I don't have a PhD or anything like that, but I love ideas and I love discussion, and so that's kind of my motivation for even making this video and opening this up to you all to participate and have a flourishing discussion, hopefully. Along with that, too, I should say that it took me so long because I wanted to parse out these ideas fully. And it's not that that was the only thing I was reading. I was going through graduate school. I actually started this book like right after I started grad school, and now we're here almost 2 years later, and it's like, wow, that was one fast, and two, took me a while to finish that. And so I'm glad I finished it and I'm also glad that I took my time because it was very difficult. It was very difficult to read, but we're here, and I'm glad because I had so many rich connections, and that's why it's hard for me to just talk so pointedly about this, because I've made so many connections over the year and a half with just the words on these 82 pages, just these ideas that Nietzsche fleshes out, that I don't know, I can't help but talk about them. And so I'm going to try to keep it as pointed and precise as I can, but also not trying to leave out anything that I think might be important. And so now what I think might be important and what you might think is important are two different things, but hopefully that refines over the next 3 books. Nietzsche talks about discusses two main points. And so at least that I could flesh out. First point is regarding nihilism in its framework, and then he talks more broadly about European nihilism and kind of what brought that about. And I think it's important that when we encounter these ideas, that we know kind of what's going on in the wider context. And so I'm glad that Nietzsche parses out the history of nihilism and doesn't just start with speculation and just talking about it. And I would never attribute that to Nietzsche, especially because this is regarded as his magnum opus, and that this is kind of his seminal work and amalgamation of all the different ideas and principles into this idea of the will to power. And so I'm glad that he didn't skip over that because it's important. When we think about nihilism, I've kind of been able to piece together a framework. And I like to think in frameworks. I think it makes it simpler, and it also helps you understand more richly the ideas that you're trying to discuss. And so, like in therapy, I work from a cognitive behavioral perspective. And so that's the framework that I use when I encounter clients. And I also try to mix in a bit of existential philosophy, and I also try to mix in a bit of rational emotive behavioral therapy, and which are all very similar, and they deal with very similar concepts. But it helps me see like the things that a client is pulling and say, okay, here's what I think in the context of my framework. And when something doesn't work, that's okay, because then we figure out something else. But so with Nietzsche, I wanted to make kind of a framework and try to understand what he's saying. And he does write it out very well, but Nietzsche's also not very clear. He wasn't using fancy graphs or anything. Maybe something I might try to construe. I haven't decided yet. But whether or not I include it, you'll get to be the judge. But so this framework that I've been able to extrapolate out kind of more or less goes like this. And so you start with exhaustion, okay, which you have to understand what he's talking about with exhaustion. And so Nietzsche discusses exhaustion in the context of the will. The will to life, the will to being is exhausted. It's exhausted by what? It's exhausted by Christian morality. And not just Christian morality from what we might get in the scriptures, but the carrying out of Christian morality. And so we are in the year 2023, and up until this point, I think right now there are over 200 Christian denominations, and that fracturing is kind of what led Nietzsche to believe that we are getting exhausted, because what the Bible posits is a universal truth, right? It is the truth from God, the one and only God, the true God, the God above all else, right? It has the one truth, and from that we can say that there should be one denomination, one sect of people that come from that. But instead, what we've seen is that over the thousands of years that have, progressed since the death of Christ, is that we have seen actually just this fracturing, and that occurred, and Nietzsche actually points it out by kind of omitting that fact because, again, my framework for looking at problems usually deals with especially like psychological problems, which nihilism is a psychological problem. And so I try to look at the event. And because we're looking at it intergenerationally, we can try to look at a generational event or an event in history, let's say. And so what Nietzsche actually admits in the century he has not analyzed so far is the 16th century, 15th and 16th century. And he analyzes the 17th century and he labels it broadly as aristocratic, that it was very highbrow. And then he talks about the 18th century as being very feminine and sensual. And then the 19th century is animalistic and dark and weak-willed, but more truer and baser than all the rest. And so he does analyze these past three centuries, and then he also provides some indication of the future. But he omits the 15th and 16th centuries, kind of. The only time he really mentions them is when he mentions what is good. And so we can say, what was the point that was good? And broadly, he asks the question, what is good? And he identifies what is good because he's discussing beyond good and evil. He says what is good is having some ability and using it to create. And he says, like the Italian Renaissance. And so the Renaissance occurred in the 15th, 16th century, depending on whether or not you believe in long Renaissance or short Renaissance, but that's for the historians to decide on the validity of that. I'm just here to talk about nihilism. And so there's two main events that I think happened in the Renaissance that are significant to the advent of nihilism, and initially this exhaustion, right? And so we have the Protestant Reformation, and so we have the establishment of the church, the Lutheran Church, and then we also have the establishment of the Church of England, both in the 16th century. And then also at the late 15th century, we have the discovering of the Americas. And so throughout history, we've been going up. And, there's been little bits of expansion and little intermixes of, squabbling here and there with wars, like, a lot of wars. And so, but during this whole time, the West, right, we could say that the West has existed for the last 3,500 years, and it's had a consistent narrative orientated towards flourishing. We could say that, and trying to figure out what that is. And they ask different questions, different thinkers ask different questions, some empirical, some, philosophical, and all else in between. And so we're all building up in this conversation of what is significant, and we're trying to achieve a higher moral state. And so we're building up, and we achieve this Renaissance where everything continues to go up. We create and create and create, and we have wonderful ideas. And then what happens is we discover the Americas, and we could say that this represents material and this represents spiritual. And so we have spiritual and material both working upwards with, we could say art, where art is maybe that, and Nietzsche seems to think so, that art is that like intermingling between the two of the divine and the spiritual and the material, because we're trying to encapsulate that in art. And so we're building up, and then we discover the Americas. And Nietzsche doesn't quite talk about this. Where I'm getting this from is from Carl Jung and talking about the expansion, but that's a book that I hope to review sometime soon. But anyway, so we're building up, and then one side slips down because we start, instead of building up, we start discovering the Americas and expanding out and going this way. And then we discover the Americas, and not so long after that, what happens? Churches start to fracture, and so we slowly slide out, and now both are leveled out. It's no longer the elevation that we were achieving prior. It's now the leveling, and we're down in the muck and in the material and really just in this milieu that exists on both sides, right? And so this, I think, is that event before the exhaustion, that caused the exhaustion. Because Nietzsche seems to think, and he parses out that idea, that the fracturing of Christianity really was because he disdains Protestantism. He does not like it, which is ironic because his father was a Lutheran priest, I believe. I believe he was Lutheran. He was German, so it makes sense. And so he was a Lutheran priest, and he disdains it. And he was actually going to go follow in his footsteps, but he ended up not. But So he thinks that Protestantism is just this awful thing because it's led to this point, right? And so we have the exhaustion. We get exhausted because we've put so much effort into this, right? We did so much up, and now we're just out. And so what happens? The 17th century, individuals continue to live as they were, and then it starts to compound. And so then we achieve the sensuality of the 18th century, the romanticism, the femininity that's associated with that. And then we achieve the animalist part of the 19th century that Nietzsche classifies. And then I'm not quite sure what he says about the 20th century. He indicates some indications of war, but it was kind of fun kind of parsing through that. But so we have the 19th century, which is animalistic, and then we know what happens between then and now. And so there's that exhaustion, but it's not just exhaustion that causes nihilism. There's intermixes between there. And so we have exhaustion, and then we have indulgence. Because what do you do when you come home after a long day of work? You indulge. You might, I don't know, binge Netflix, or you might have a drink or 5, or maybe you eat a little bit more at supper and you indulge there. Regardless, something you do indulges. And so not only at an individual level was the indulgence occurring, but a societal level, because society is inevitably made up of individuals. And so we have this indulgence that occurs, and that indulgence is logically led to decadence, because we just want more of it, right? We're exhausted, so we just want more of it. Just make it a little easier. Continue to develop technologies and feed me, please. And so we do that, and we develop these decadent societies, and that decadence, Nietzsche believes, leads to skepticism. And now I would love to get into this framework more. I'd love to parse out every piece. I actually have notes written on that and just kind of reference points in the book, but I'm just gonna let it go for right now, and let me know if you want me to parse out this framework a little bit more. I'd love to. I think it'd be really fun. But so that decadence inevitably leads to this idea that, and this pessimism. It leads to this pessimism, and the pessimism inevitably leads to skepticism, and skepticism, this questioning of the what for and the why at all, and what is this worth, and where's the meaning in all of this stuff, right? Remember, we're out here, we're in the milieu, and there's nothing up, right? And so we're out, and so what is it worth? That's the question that we're trying to ask, right, in our skepticism. And that skepticism leads to the nihilism, the acknowledgement, Nietzsche says, to the nothingness of the universe. And not the universe itself, but just the universe of our existence. And so I am just flipping here to Nietzsche's definition of nihilism, because I think that's important. And he tricks you. He presents this really simple idea right away. He gives you the answer, what nihilism is. And I think it's really, it kind of caught me off guard, because I'm like, oh, that was easy. And then I started questioning, and then I started reading more, and I'm like, oh my goodness, what does this actually mean? And so what does nihilism mean? This is on literally the first section, the first bit on the first section of the first book. And so what does nihilism mean? That the highest values devalue themselves. The aim is lacking. Why finds no answer. And so we can see how that might occur because of this fracturing, because there's all this ambiguity of truth, of all these different sects trying to call themselves truth. And now you might say, well, maybe the truth isn't Christian. I think that we could explore that idea, but I think that we would find ourselves lacking. And I think that Nietzsche explores a little bit of Buddhism, but I think that ultimately Nietzsche not concedes in that he posited as a viable alternative, but that he sees it as just this parallel to nihilism in the East, right? This craving for nothingness. He talks a lot about cravings and desires, such as Schopenhauer did, and so he analyzes Schopenhauer. And so you can see how rich this discussion is. It's been very eventful 82 pages. I'm not going to lie. It's been fun parsing this through and trying to understand what this is. And I was constantly battling with like wanting to read more, but also holding back and trying to really understand these ideas a bit further before even reading further sections in the book. And so I really took my time and tried to understand what he was saying and what he meant. And I think absolutely that Nietzsche would agree that the fundamental conversation of the West has resulted. It's not that Christianity contributed. It's that Christianity is a cause of the conversation of the West. Because if we found it not to be true, we wouldn't have put so much effort into it. And that's where the skepticism is so significant of just, well, why does it matter that you question your faith? Well, because it's the back of everything that we've done thus far and everything that we've defended as a society, as Western culture. And it's like, oh, okay, actually, yeah, that is really significant. Okay, and so we see nihilism as this ambiguity, as this uncertainty, as this acceptance that there is not really anything significant, that everything lacks meaning. And I think that that's fundamentally important to understanding today, because when we look at today, and honestly, reading Nietzsche, reading these first 82 pages, and even like Zarathustra, I've read, and I think that he sounds so contemporary. He sounds like he is writing in the room next door, and that you've just had a conversation. And so he's so universal and so timeless, and it's fun to read it. And so, but it's tough. It's very tough to dig through and to sort through all of the milieu and the understanding that comes along with it. But it's fun, and I really encourage you to dive deep and let me know what you think about this, if this sparks a study into this book. But I think that it's important to try and understand these ideas as they come and try to understand them both in the context of what Nietzsche was trying to say and also how they affect us today. Because ultimately, like what I'm concerned about is the people of today, of how they are affected by these ideas, by what is going on in the world, and how they're affected by this. I also thought that it's good to note that for some reason, and I don't think it was by any means a mistake or just for fun, but I'm trying to find it here, because Nietzsche goes into, he actually dedicates a lot of time to it. He talks about socialism to a great extent and virtually just abolishes any argument for it and just kind of overcomes socialism very quickly. And I don't know if that's a surprise to anybody else. It's not a surprise to me necessarily, but it is a surprise to see him spend so much time, because he spends literally like almost a page and a half discussing socialism. And so I'm just going to read a little bit for you here on just how important it is to understanding the individuals who purport ideas and systems like this and how they play out, because that's ultimately the most important thing, is how does it affect us today? Because that's what we care about. That's where this becomes important, and realizing that these aren't just words on a page of a guy who wrote something 130, 40 years ago, that it's important to us today, because these are the exact ideas that are playing out in our world right now, whether or not we like it. And so it's very, very important that we discuss these ideas openly and try to determine their validity and whether or not that we can make improvements on ourselves, with ourselves, regarding these topics. And so socialism, he says, this is 125, written in 1885. Socialism as the logical conclusion of the tyranny of the least and the dumbest, i.e. those who are superficial, envious, and three-quarters actors, is indeed entailed by modern ideas and their latent anarchism. But in the tepid air of democratic well-being, the capacity to reach conclusions or to finish weakens. One follows, but one no longer sees what follows. Therefore, socialism is on the whole a hopeless and sour affair, and nothing offers a more amusing spectacle than the contrast between the poisonous and desperate faces cut by today's socialists, and to what wretched and pinched feelings their style bears witness. Here he's kind of making fun of just how they dress, which I think is still important today, and the harmless lamb's happiness of their hopes and desires. He says desiderata, but I butcher that word, and so it just means desires. And so then he goes on to talk about how it is, while they are kind of goofy and foolish, that it is important to understand what they bring to the table, and they bring destruction. He says that they bring destruction, and that the coups will continue to occur over time, especially when we reach points in society that we maybe aren't taking care of people so well. And so basically the antidote, and this checks out with all the other philosophy that I've encountered and been exposed to in both my political philosophy classes and elsewhere, that especially Aristotle is very fervently against the ideas of socialism and communism. And so I think that he points out very correctly that it's important, because when we get to a point where maybe the quality of life is too low, that actually what we are doing is setting ourselves up for a socialist revolution, something that nobody actually wants. Not even the socialists really want the socialist revolution, but it gives them purpose, and it offers an alternative to the nihilist, because they could say, well, nothing has meaning, but then they look for another god. They look for something significant, right? Because in their desperation, they turn and they're weak, and so they look for something else, and they say, here's the state. I got it. Okay, this is good. Then we can take care of people and everybody will be happy and it'll be fine. And so in their weakness, they turn to something that is false. And I think that that's a theme that we see throughout history, is that when people are exhausted, when they encounter something like nihilism, something akin to it, or nihilism itself, that they turn to something that appears strong, that appears to give unity and provide hope and building, and has the appearance that it might provide flourishing, but ends up just wreaking havoc across the whole system and more than they'd ever hoped for. And so it's important that as active participants in any society, whether it's political or not, that we're able to parse through these ideas and say, okay, that's not good. Okay, we need to improve that a little bit, so maybe the socialists don't quite grab a hold of it, because we don't want that. We don't want that at all. It doesn't lead to a flourishing society. It only leads to, as he points out, a society for essentially narcissists, right? A narcissistic society will always fail, because it's always a house divided amongst itself, because narcissists don't even know what they want. They just want themselves more. And so it's tough. But Nietzsche parses that out, and I think it's great. Overall, I know that was kind of broad. That was a very sweeping analysis of the book. I think that it is important to try and dig into this yourself. I know that it's very, very pertinent to today, and also just understanding philosophy in general, because I don't think enough people understand that philosophy is shaping their lives, whether they like it or not. And this was a thing that was posited to me in my undergrad philosophy courses that I had taken as part of my minor. I had a professor say to me, he said, well, if you're not doing philosophy, who's doing it for you? Because either you're actively doing philosophy or someone else is doing your philosophy for you. And what are their conclusions? How might that impact your life? Would you rather have the reins, or would you rather let go of the reins? And so I think it's important for us. I at least don't like anybody else taking control and leading my thoughts and my framework. I like to be independent. And so I think it's important for us to dig through these ideas and to encounter them as they come, and to try and make sense of them. Because, yeah, if we're not doing the philosophy, if we're not doing the work, somebody else is doing it for us. And so let me know below what your thoughts were. I'd love to do the next 3 books of this, just to give a brief summary and kind of my thoughts on it. Ultimately, I think the philosophy for especially the point of exhaustion and indulgence. We can understand as just this dichotomy, right? Or not this dichotomy, this logical conclusion, this framework that we can say when someone's exhausted, they indulge. It's just a fact almost. Actually, I would say it is a fact because everything's compensatory in nature. And that's what I've really learned from Carl Jung is that everything, for every action, right? And this is Newton, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so there's a give and a take always. And so how can we defend ourselves and become more resilient? I think that's a question that I want to explore further. I don't think I'm going to do that today, but it's something that I'd like to know your thoughts, and it's something I'd like to explore in a later episode. I'm not sure quite the direction I might go there, but I have quite a few ideas on it. But regardless, thank you for joining me. That is my summary of the first 82 pages of The Will to Power by Friedrich Nietzsche. I think, I did forget to mention that this is the Walter Kaufmann edition. This is edited by Walter Kaufmann. It is really wonderful to just read his subnotes and to just dive into what he has to say. He pulls really pertinent information, and I think that he really understands Nietzsche kind of the way that we might want to understand Nietzsche, just in the context of what Nietzsche was trying to say then and all of Nietzsche's little quips, especially about like the socialists and how they dress, right? And so he points it out, and it's really, really enlightening to the wider context of what Nietzsche's saying, and also kind of what Nietzsche's other works have to say in this regard. And so I think it was really good to have this work by Kaufmann. I think it is the most popular edition. It's definitely the edition that I've seen the most. I've enjoyed reading it. I think it's easier to read than some translations I've had to read for other foreign authors, I guess. And so it's been really good. I really encourage the Kaufmann edition, and I hope you check it out. Let me know if you do. I'd love to connect and talk about these ideas further, but for now, that's all I really have for this. I did want to mention that briefly, I do have a lot of plans for the podcast, for the channel. I know that I've taken some time off, and I want to briefly explain what's gone on. And so I had grad school. I started kind of coming back into it in January. I kind of just came and said, haha, here's my goals. And I didn't really think I would have as much difficulty in the final few months of grad school as I did. Everyone kind of said that it was, it's an easy semester, and it turned out not to be whatsoever, because I was doing internship and classes and trying to be a husband and all these things that were just compiling and conflicting with one another. And I said, one has to give. And so I had put out a post about like being a couple days late, and then that episode just never ended up happening because I had a bunch of technical difficulties, and I just kind of despaired and said, well, okay, that's the thing that has to give. Although I made my video on 2023 goals. I thought it was really good. I thought it was really optimistic. Might have been too optimistic, but that's okay, because when we make goals, we can always see how they work and then adjust accordingly to how it's actually playing out. And so sometimes we bite off more than we can chew. That's okay. Let's just reevaluate and go from there. And so I have plans. I hope to be releasing episodes every other week, just like I have been, and hopefully that frequency improves over time. But right now, I'm just still getting used to talking in front of a camera again, and getting used to dealing with these ideas and making content. And I'm trying to release more short videos, and so I'm going to be pushing those a little bit. And so I encourage you to go check them out. They're kind of fun. I just explore like little ideas. So it's kind of like I pull from my Twitter feed. I am on Twitter. I'm pretty active there, probably the most active there. I'm looking to start expanding my Instagram and YouTube, or not YouTube, well, YouTube, but Instagram and Facebook as well. And so I'm also going to do some writing on Substack and Medium. And so I'm just going to kind of be all over the place, but all working towards getting ideas and increasing the conversations that we're having about key ideas that play out in our lives. And so I hope that you follow along on each of those. I know I have the links below, so you can go follow along. If you're still along and this is your first time, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave a comment down below. Let me know that you made it to the end of the video. It'd be wonderful. And so just to see how many people make it to the end. And so, yeah, let me know down below that you made it to the end, and also whatever questions you have about the will to power, if there's any other questions you have about it, or your own thoughts on the will to power, because I'm excited to get into the portion of the book that actually discusses the will to power a little bit. He talks about it just a little bit in this one, but not as deeply as I know he's going to. And so it was really fun. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you all next time.